Hello there.
General Kenobi.
Welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is cjmichelli. I am the author of the Christian fantasy book series, The Endurance Saga. Let's jump right into it. So, as you can see from the title, I'm going to talk about a 3-act structure. Now, first, before we talk about the 3 acts, let's talk about structure. When you're writing a story, you need to have structure. And the most basic, structural idea you can have is a beginning and an end, right? But a good story also has a middle part. You can't just say, hello, goodbye. There has to be a beginning, a middle, and an end. And those are your 3 acts. Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. Beginning, middle, end. The 3-act structure. But when you get down to the nitty-gritty, there's a certain way that the 3-act structure should flow that'll really help to round out your story. So it's a 3-act structure, but it has little stepping stones along the way. Now, just to be clear, I didn't get the ideas in this video from my own head. I didn't come up with this. The 3-act structure is a very ancient thing, and the particular structure I'm going to share with you, I actually learned from best-selling author James Scott Bell in his great course, How to Write Best-Selling Fiction. I actually was lucky enough to take this course for free recently because it's actually available through my local library. So I took the course and learned a lot, and here's one of the most important things that I learned, which is the 3-act structure. Now, James Scott Bell talks about how you can't just have 3 sections, although that's great. There's a little more to it than that. If you really want to refine your 3-act structure, you need to add in doorways, I think he called them. You have to have a doorway into the first act. You have to have a doorway from the first act into the second act, a doorway from the second act into the third act, and a doorway from the third act out back into real life. He also adds in a who am I moment where the main character has to really grapple with his or her identity, his or her destiny, and really trying to figure out what to do in the story. Now, a great who am I moment, because the who am I moment in the example I'm going to give from a movie is not as strong as this one. In the film, How to Train Your Dragon, the original, the animated version, the real version, not going to get into the whole remake culture. How to Train Your Dragon. There's a moment kind of toward the end of the film where the trained dragon, Toothless, is separated from his rider, Hiccup. And then he's taken off to the islands, and Hiccup is left alone and dragonless back on the island of Berk. So then Hiccup stands out overlooking the sea, and his girlfriend comes up and they have this great little talk. But this is Hiccup's who am I moment. Like, what am I really going to do about this? What is my real identity? What is my real destiny here? What do I do? You get an even better example in How to Train Your Dragon 2, because when he has his who am I moment in that film, he has the whole funeral, and then at the end of that funeral, he's really grappling again with identity and destiny. And his mother comes alongside him and says, you are the bridge between the worlds of humans and dragons. That is who you are, son. Boom. You could not have a better example of a who am I moment than a character actually literally telling your main character, this is who you are. So that's the who am I moment. James Scott Bell likes to put that moment in the exact center point of the story. I actually don't think that's the best place to put it, and you often don't find it in the very center of the story, I think for good reason. I think the best place to put it, well, we'll get to that. So, my favorite movie for a long, long time, it might still be my favorite. My very favorite movie is the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which I regard as a single film. Sue me. But my favorite movie is The Lord of the Rings. But a close second, maybe equally so, and sometimes probably even more so than Lord of the Rings, is Avatar. Not Avatar: The Last Airbender. Those movies don't exist in my mind or my heart. What I'm talking about is the 2009 film by James Cameron with all the big blue alien people. People's opinions differ on this story. I actually think it's really, really deep and archetypical, but that's a whole other video unto itself. But it's a very, very well-structured story, and it aligns very nicely with the structure that I will propose to you now. The first moments, or the first, paragraph, the first line, or whatever, what have you. In a film, it'd be the first scene, right? the very first thing that your audience sees needs to grab their attention. I call this the snap. It's like the author is reaching up into the audience's world and saying, hey, pay attention to my story. This story is worth listening to, worth reading, worth watching. You're kind of saying, you know, ooh, shiny, like my story. So you're snapping your fingers, you're getting the audience's attention, big smile on your face. Hey, this is going to be fun. Pay attention. Hey, watch this. So the snap is the doorway into the story. So you snap. Then you have what I call the intro, which is where you start learning about the characters and the world. So let's use Avatar as a jumping off point for these plot structures. The snap. In Avatar, the opening sequence is first is darkness, and you get that classic Avatar music. There's a drum beat. You get Jake Sully's little poem he says at the beginning about have this dream of flying, and you always have to wake up. And then he actually wakes up and everything's floating around him, including little water droplets. That whole sequence is a snap. It's establishing, wow, okay, rainforest, poetry, the deep idea of identity and consciousness. And then he wakes up and there's water droplets floating around. It's this big, wonderful snap of like, whoa, 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 wow, wow, wow. Look at what we get to look at here. Boom. We are invested in watching at least the next few minutes of this story. Then we have the introduction, where we learn about Jake, and we learn about his world and his new world, and we get introduced to all these wonderful things, characters like Grace, like Quaritch, like Parker. We get introduced to the whole world, the concept of avatars, Na'vi, and then Jake ends up actually going out into the world of Pandora. And that's where we get to the end of our introduction, because then we have an inciting incident. We have something that happens to the main character that forces him to make a choice. Or her, but in this case it's him. Forces him to make a choice. And this is the next doorway. So in Avatar we have the snap, which is that little introduction with poetry and the water droplets. Then we have the introduction, which is Jake being introduced to the wider world of Avatar life on Pandora, and the main supporting characters of the film, the main concepts. But then we get right down to his battle with Palulukan, with the big lizard tiger, which is what I called it as a kid, me and my brothers. The big lizard tiger. But the lizard tiger attacks him, and Jake physically leaps off of a cliff, which gets us into Act 2. So I named this next plot structure after the Avatar film. This next part that leads you from Act 1 into Act 2 is called the leap. The main character makes an agentive decision, not something that you necessarily physically get pushed into, although you can do that, but it's less satisfying for the reader and the audience. Have the main character make a big decision that drives the plot forward and moves the story, and the character really gets moving in his or her destiny. And we see that with Jake. He has this ballsy move where he jumps off a cliff, and that leap carries us into Act 2. And then, of course, Act 2 is Jake getting embedded in the Omaticaya, the tribes of the Na'vi, and he learns to be one of them. We have this whole thing that goes up and up and up, and tension builds as we see these two worlds about to collide. We see Jake with his two identities clashing, where he's learning to be Na'vi, but he's also human, and he has his duty to the RDA. He also has his duty to the people, and so it all it grows in conflict. It escalates. So we have the snap, we have the intro, we have the leap, and the leap carries us into Act 2, which I call escalation. At this point, the tension in your story should be going up, steadily up. Now it can do this. It can zigzag up. It can go wavy up and up and up, but it needs to be going up. It needs to escalate. And then we get to this moment, our next doorway, which leads us into Act 3. And this doorway, I call the punch. It's at this point that the antagonist, which could be a force of nature, it could be a situation, it could be a person, it could be a system, whatever the antagonistic force is working anti or against your protagonist, the antagonist punches your main character. Now, the form that this takes in particular in Avatar is the destruction of Home Tree. This is when Quaritch shows up, fires missiles at the bottom of the tree, and he goes, "Ooh," you know, it falls down and, you know, destroys everything, and everything catches on fire. And at this point, Jake is cast out from the Omaticaya, and he's alone. He's cast out from the humans, he's cast out from the aliens, he's all alone. He hits rock bottom. That's the punch. The punch is a major blow to the protagonist's destiny, the major blow to his identity, major blow to his progress. Everything comes crashing down in the moment of the punch. It's the low point of the story. And this is the point in which you find Jake's crisis of identity. This is where you find him having his who am I moment. This is when you have him making his big choice, just like with Hiccup. When Toothless was taken from him in the first film, Hiccup had to reckon with his identity and his destiny. Who am I really? And that's where we see him decide, no, F it, I am a dragon rider. That's who I am. And boom, he goes off and he does the whole, you know, thing at the end of the film. But for Jake, he has to grapple with this and figure out, am I a person who's going to just sit back and say, you know what, okay, take me to jail. I guess I'm going to stay here. I'm going to be a human, just accept the consequences of my actions, etc., etc. No. He has to accept the consequences of some of his actions on one side or the other, and he chooses to accept the consequences of his actions as one of the people, one of the Na'vi. And so he ends up making the decision to go off and support them. And so he ultimately sides with their cause, and that's his identity now. His destiny now is tied up in their identity and destiny. That's his choice. So the punch brings us to rock bottom, and then that's where your who am I really moment is, and the character comes back up and soars into the final climax of the film, or the book, your story. The climax is exactly what it sounds like. It's the high point, it's the explosion of the full energy of the story coming to a head all at once. You get this big, it's often a final battle, right? It's often a battle scene in like a superhero movie or a movie like Avatar. It's often a battle. So Jake goes off and fights the big battle, and he, you know, of course, wins because he's the main character. And then you get down past the battle, and you can't just have, you know, the bad guy getting blown up or something and then roll credits. That's not how stories work. There has to be some kind of off-ramp from the story, some kind of doorway that leads you back out into the real world that isn't so jarring. You can't just like leave it with the bad guy hits the ground, boom, credits. So this is the part of the story where you need to wave goodbye to your audience. I call this the wave. So we have the snap to get your reader's attention. We have the introduction to get the lay of the land, introduce everything. Then you have the leap where your main character jumps off into Act 2 and gets this whole escalation going up, 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 to the punch where the antagonist smacks your main character all the way down to rock bottom. Your character has to reckon with his identity and destiny. He rises up into the climax, you know, of course, prevails depending on the story. But then after the climax, whatever its conclusion is, you have to wave goodbye to your characters. You have to wave goodbye to your audience. And in Avatar, what we see for the wave is that Jake signs off for the last time on his little video recording, and he goes off in his wheelchair, and we don't know what he's doing until he shows up in the Omaticaya location underneath the big tree, and he ends up getting transferred into his avatar body, and he becomes actually fully Na'vi. He abandons his human identity altogether, and he just becomes one of the people. And the big wave moment is when we zoom in on his face, and all of a sudden, boom, his eyes open, the music flourishes, and you know we have this big rise and the beat and everything. So that's the off-ramp, that's the wave in Avatar. The wave in, going back to our How to Train Your Dragon example, right? The who am I moment is right after the punch, where Hiccup and Toothless get separated. Hiccup decides he's going to go after Toothless, and so he goes and he rises up into the climax. He prevails, but at a cost. But then the wave is, okay, Hiccup won. He won the battle. But then the wave is Hiccup waking up, realizing that he's injured, reuniting with his dad and his friends, and then riding his dragon off into the sky. And then that's when the credits roll. So we get this nice off-ramp from Hiccup that tells us Hiccup is okay. He is fulfilling his destiny. He's moving off into a happily for now sort of ending. We get the same kind of ending from Avatar. So yeah, that's basically the 3-act structure. I'll superimpose it on screen again for you here. This has been absolutely instrumental in me getting better as an author. when I went back after learning the 3-act structure, like something like this, I went back and looked at my earlier books, and the 3-act structure is maimed. Is kind of the best word I can think of right now. The 3-act structure in those books is maimed, because you can see some structural elements in my earliest novels, but you really don't see the fully formed 3-act structure as I've described here. Now, why do we do a 3-act structure? Why do we do structure in this way? It's kind of like the same thing as songs, right? You have verse 1, chorus, verse 2, chorus, bridge, chorus, chorus. Why do songs take that form all across our culture? It's because it sells, it works. It's deeply satisfying to sing songs that way. The reason why the 3-act structure with snap, intro, leap, escalation, punch, who am I, climax, wave, why is this structure the one? It's because it sells, and it's emotionally satisfying. There's a huge emotional payout when you structure your story this way. So that's kind of why to do it. And ever since I started structuring my stories around this concept, around this structure, around this framework, the quality of my writing has soared. So if you are new to writing, welcome to a fantastic hobby and career. Use this 3-act structure. Even in a very short story, use this structure. Okay, pro tip, use this structure in your chapters. Regardless of what kind of chapter you're writing, your chapter needs to have a 3-act structure. It needs to have an attention getter at the beginning. It needs to have an introduction to get you the lay of the land. You need to have your protagonist making some kind of big decision, a decision that drives the rest of the chapter. Then you need to have an escalation where the tension rises throughout the chapter. Then you have to have a punch where something kind of goes wrong, or at least goes a little bit sideways, and then the character has to solve a problem. You go into the climax, and then your wave is your goodbye to this chapter and on to the next. Now, obviously, your wave at the end of a chapter is going to be different from your wave at the end of a book or a movie. But it needs to be a good doorway into the next part of your story. This can often be a cliffhanger or a little zinger at the end, like, if only she knew what was on the other side of that door, she would never have opened it. I gotta read chapter 17 now. Like, how am I supposed to leave it alone at that point? So your wave looks a little bit different in the middle of the story versus, the very end of the story. But you still need to have structure in each chapter. Then there's arguments about how granular to do it, and some people argue that you should really have a 3-act structure in every sentence. I'm not that anal about it, at least not yet. And if you've been writing for years and years, and you're just rolling your eyes at this whole video, hi, welcome to you too. I really make this video for people who are new to writing and new to structure. I realize that there's a lot of videos out there like this, but just in case mine happens to be the first video that you see, here is a little overview of structure. And hopefully it helps you in your writing. If the video helps you, let me know in the comments below. Here's a great exercise. If you want to learn about 3-act structure, here's what I did. I make myself a little graph of 3 little rectangles all touching, right? And then I have those doorways at the end. I have the snap, the leap, the punch, and the wave. And then I take all those and I start labeling them. Like for Avatar, right? So next to your snap, you write in, okay, that's where we have spaceship, water droplets, poetry, rainforest. Boom, that's your snap. And then your intro is learning about Jake's life, landing at Hell's Gate, meeting Grace, meeting Quaritch, meeting Parker, landing in Pandora, and all these things. That leaping from cliff. So on and on you go. You can just label all these things all the way through, and you can plot out other people's stories. And then what you can do is come to your own story, make yourself a little chart, and ask yourself, okay, I know what happens in the escalation, the climax, and the wave. What's my punch moment? Draw a little lineup. Okay. 3 different ideas off the top of your head. Main character gets bisected. Main character's loved one dies. That's a good one. And on it goes. Lots of ideas. And use this structure to plot your own story. I've been rambling long enough That's basically my 3-act structure as I use it in all of my novels right now. If I end up changing that structure in any significant way, I'll make another video. With that, have a great week. At the time of this video, we have Thanksgiving and Christmas coming up in 2025. Happy Thanksgiving, Merry Christmas if you're seeing this in real time. I'll see you in the next video.